Well, that was the UN humanitarian chief. Let's speak now to the Israeli government spokesperson, Eylon Levy, who joins me now live from Tel Aviv. Mr. Levy, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. I'm just going to take you back to the beginning of our programme. Our audiences watched an investigation that Sky News did, which included the death of parents of 3 children, where the three children, age 11, 9 and 5, watched their parents killed in front of their very eyes. Then the 2 children say that they were interrogated by the IDF. I just want to get your reaction and response to this.
I've seen that report. It is, of course, very upsetting. I believe that the IDF is currently investigating that incident. I think, if true, it's another reminder of the real tragedy that Hamas has brought on the people of the Gaza Strip by launching this needless war with the October 7 massacre and fighting from inside civilian areas. But as I said, I believe that incident is under investigation, and I'm afraid I have no further information.
You're talking about Hamas bringing this on the Palestinian people, and we've just been talking about that on the programme. But this specific case, this was the IDF storming a house, breaking down the door, throwing a grenade in, blinding a child and killing their parents.
As I said, these are the claims. They are being investigated, and I'm afraid I simply have no more information to contribute.
Eylon, these reports are profoundly disturbing, to the point where Israel's staunchest allies are now asking questions about civilian deaths. They say they're investigating, they're condemning, and they're also saying this needs to stop, that the civilian deaths in Gaza are just way too high.
Look, we agree, obviously, that civilian casualties are way too high, because everyone who has been killed since October 7th would still be alive if Hamas had not launched this war, and if Hamas were not fighting this war from inside densely populated areas. You are falling into Hamas's trap. Hamas's strategy is based on using human shields.
Mr. Levy, I have spoken to retired U.S. generals who are staunchly, stand by Israel's right to defend itself, who have from October 7 said that publicly. But they say they are extremely disturbed by what they're seeing happen right now in Gaza, by these civilian deaths. You say that Hamas has brought this on their people, that they hide behind civilian casualties, they fight from within densely populated areas. These generals have told me how difficult it is, that kind of urban warfare, to be conducted. However, surely the IDF is expected to adhere to different standards than Hamas's.
Those US generals know better than anyone else that the war that Israel is fighting now cannot be compared to anything else in terms of the complexity of the urban environment. No army in the history of the world, including the United States, has had to fight against a terror organization that spent 16 years embedding itself under civilian areas, building a tunnel network 1.5 times longer than the London Underground, with shafts inside of homes, schools, hospitals, mosques and kindergartens, holding 134 hostages and firing rockets at the home front.
Mr. Levy, the IDF is expected to adhere to the laws of armed conflict and take all reasonable measures to avoid civilian casualties. They are expected to operate at a different standard to Hamas's.
You are right. And Israel is enforcing those standards, operating in an intensely difficult environment that no army in the history of the world has ever had to deal with.
Oxfam, I'm just going to bring in some stats, because Oxfam says Israel's military is killing Palestinians at an average rate of 250 a day. They've used publicly available data. They've said that they've calculated that the number of average deaths per day for Gaza is higher than any other recent major armed conflict. That includes Syria, Sudan, Iraq, Ukraine, Afghanistan and Yemen.
I want to explain Hamas's strategy to you, because I can see that you are falling into the trap that Hamas has set for you and for the whole global media.
I'm absolutely not falling into any traps. I'm saying that the generals I'm speaking to are saying that they hold the IDF to a higher standard, to a different standard, and surely that is reasonable to believe that.
The IDF is enforcing the principles of international law. in a challenging environment that no army in the history of the world has had to deal with, facing an enemy that is deliberately hiding under civilian areas and an environment in which UN agencies are actively resisting our efforts to evacuate civilians to safety and get them out of places where terrorists are trying to use them as human shields. That is why you see Hamas's tunnel shafts poking out in schools, in homes.
You know, you say this, and yet we've seen Israeli hostages shot dead after they were holding white flags, you know, saying that they were civilians. They were shot dead by the IDF. We've seen reports done by colleagues here in Britain, by ITV, of civilians waving white flags and then being shot dead.
No, Israel is targeting Hamas terrorists. That was indeed a tragic incident with the 3 hostages, and the army was clear that should not have happened. Thankfully, we've been able to get 112 of them out alive, including 2 who were rescued in one of the most daring and successful rescue operation missions in the history of warfare. But you are falling into Hamas's trap.
You're saying that, but I'm telling you that I'm not falling into Hamas's trap. I'm talking about the IDF and the high standards in which the world holds the IDF. That their staunchest allies are now, you know, saying that these civilian casualties, the death toll that we're seeing is unacceptable. You're saying I'm falling into Hamas's trap. I'm telling you that the UK, the US, France, Germany are all saying that the civilian casualties, the death toll is too high.
The United States reaffirmed it is our shared goal to see the defeat of Hamas, because that is the only possible response to the October 7th massacre. It is horrific that civilians are being hurt. None of them would be hurt if Hamas had not launched this war, and if Hamas were not deliberately embedding itself in civilian areas, so that the images of humanitarian suffering will play on your nerves and get international pressure to try to force Israel to stop. This is part of Hamas's stick strategy of sacrificing their own civilians to try to generate international sympathy. And when the international community turns around to Israel and accuses it of being responsible for civilian casualties, instead of pointing the finger at the terror organization that launched this war and is hiding behind them, in fact, like the UN official you just interviewed, who denied that Hamas is a terror organization in the first place, they are telling terror organizations that their strategy of using human shields works, because that will generate international pressure that will force the campaign to stop and leave that terror organization on its feet. And we think that allies and partners around the world that want to see this war come to a swift conclusion, as we all do, should demand one very simple thing. Hamas should surrender. It should lay down its arms, hand over its war criminals for a tribunal, and release the hostages immediately. That, by the way, referring to the previous interview you had with Mr. Griffiths, is what is keeping everyone in this country awake at night.
Mr. Levy, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. Now let's digest